MR Night Story delivers chilling tales from the darkest corners of reality. Story 1. The Airbnb Intruder. This happened in July of last year. My house was having some pretty big problems and I was left without power for several days. I work from home, so this was a major issue and I had to rent an Airbnb. The closest one at a reasonable price was about a 45-minute drive away, in a smaller, more secluded area of the city, not considered the best neighborhood. I arrived and went straight to bed. In the morning I set up my workspace. Just before I started work, there was a knock at the door. On the porch was a man, maybe in his early 30s, covered in tattoos. He didn't look like an Airbnb host. Unsure why he was there, I walked away from the door and started work. I didn't leave my desk until 8 p.m. After picking up dinner, another knock came. It was the same guy. I walked away again. 30 minutes later, around 1 a.m., I decided to work another hour. I put my headphones in. After I finished, I went to turn on the light and felt a chill. Down the hallway were faint shoe prints, even behind my desk. Terrified, I followed them to the back door, which was cracked open. Moments later, footsteps came down the stairs. A man peered into the hallway. It was the same man. His surprise turned to rage. I turned and sprinted out the back door, running through the backyard into some trees. I called 911 but hung up when I heard footsteps. Luckily they passed by. I waited for the police. I gave a description and they found him the next day. It was him, confirmed by the tattoos. He'd broken into several homes in the days leading up. I don't know what he planned to do to me, but I'm relieved he stopped. Story 2. The Deserted Gas Station. Last year, I was driving across the country for work, visiting friends and family on the East Coast. On my 4th day, I was driving through a rural area of Pennsylvania on long, empty highways. It started raining and my fuel was low. I hadn't seen any gas stations. Finally, I saw a sign and then a small gas station nestled in the trees. It had 2 pumps and a tiny building. I pulled in. When I tried to use my card at the pump, it didn't work. The screen was off. The other pump was also off. Frustrated, I saw a small light inside the building. Hoping for help, I ran to the door. The glass was covered in moisture, but I saw a light. I opened the door and the store shelves were empty and knocked over. The light was coming from the back. I quickly stepped back outside. As I turned to my car, someone was standing next to it, drenched in water. "Hey, what are you doing?" I yelled. They looked at me, then behind me. I turned back. The front door was open and a man with long black hair and a sickly look ran at me. The other person backed away. I got in my car, but the man didn't stop. He tried opening my door. As I drove away, I heard a metallic scrape. I ran out of gas a half hour later. Luckily, I had service and got help. I saw a long scratch on my door like someone had run a knife along it. Police later told me the gas station had been out of service for at least a decade. Story 3. The Abandoned Town. About 10 months ago, I was visiting my college friend, Chris, in his small hometown. On my last night, he mentioned an abandoned house or town a few miles out in the woods. We used to go exploring, so it sounded fun. 30 minutes later, we were trekking through the woods. After about 2 hours of walking, we saw a house in the distance and then several more. They looked weathered and damaged but had modern siding. There was even a tiny gravel road. It looked like they were trying to build a community. There was graffiti on the houses. We went to the first house. Weeds were growing through the floorboards. Before we stepped in, a loud slamming sound echoed through the woods. It was quiet afterward. We went inside. It was interesting trying to figure out why anyone would abandon it. We went upstairs. It was much darker. There were 2 doors and an attic. We opened the first door to another empty room. Then we heard shuffling footsteps outside. Someone was approaching the house. They stopped at the front doorway. "Hello," a voice said. "I just want to talk." "No harm at all." He sounded older and mumbled. There was a minute of silence. Then Chris quietly went downstairs and looked at the front door. "There's nobody there," he said, pale. I checked. He was gone. There was 1 line of footprints coming from the other houses, but none leaving. We realized he must have been hiding inside and ran. We got back to Chris's place, unsure who the man was or why he wanted to talk to us. Story 4. The Backcountry Stalker. I was backpacking in the Cascades National Park. On my 3rd day, I saw a man at a campsite. We talked and he said he was heading to the peak the next day. I told him I was going there that day. I got to my campsite at the peak. The view was amazing. Nobody passed through all day. The man never showed up. I thought he'd turned around or camped somewhere else. In the morning, I packed up and started back. I got a late start and was sore. As it got dark, I put on my headlamp and walked another 3 miles to the campsite I'd seen the man at. His tent was still set up. I called out, but there was no response. The tent flap was open and nobody was inside. I felt uneasy. I looked around and saw a faint light in the distance. It was a headlamp on the ground, almost out of batteries. Then, I saw someone watching me about 10 yards away, trying not to be seen. I knew it wasn't the man from before. "Hello? Do you need help?" I said. They stood still and quiet. "I'm sorry, I'll leave," I said shakily and hurried back to the tent. The headlamp in the woods turned off. I packed up and walked another 3 miles to the next camp. I reported it, and the man I'd met was missing. There were almost no traces. Whoever I saw out there is likely the key to what happened. Story 5. The Airbnb Intruder. I booked an Airbnb for a work trip. The neighborhood was very quiet. I saw someone walking down the road, which gave me a strange feeling. I went inside and got settled. When I went to get my other bag, I saw the same person standing in the road facing the Airbnb. As I walked to my car, they walked away. I went back inside, locked up, and parked my car in the garage. I checked outside a few times. I didn't see him. I went to bed, waking up a few times. At 4 a.m., my alarm went off. I sat up and saw a light under the bedroom door. I didn't remember leaving any lights on. I got out of bed and heard something moving around at the end of the hallway. I opened the door and saw the living room light was on. A guy was in the corner searching through my bags. He wore a black hoodie and ripped jeans, just like the person I'd seen. He turned around and yelled at me to stay where I was. He started walking toward me. I ran back to the room, slamming the door shut. He rammed into it and tried to kick it down, then messed with the lock. I jumped out a window and ran. By the time the police arrived, the man was gone. My bags were gone too. The bedroom door was open. He'd picked the lock. The police thought there was more intent than just robbery. Story 6. The Camping Encounter. Earlier this spring, I was camping at a small, secluded lake 4 hours north of where I live. When I arrived, nobody else was there. Not long after, I saw a man come out of the woods on the other side and set up a tent. He looked like an average camper. Before sundown, he came over to my campsite. He introduced himself as William. We talked for a while. He was 26, around my age, and we both liked the secluded spot. After about 30 minutes, he went back to his side of the lake. Later, as I was getting ready for bed, I saw William walking around the lake. His campfire was out. He walked up to my campfire. Something was different about him. I asked if everything was okay. He smiled and was back to his friendly self. He asked if I wanted to see a cool spot with a great view. I said it was late, but he insisted the view was great because it was dark. I followed him to the other side of the lake and then through the woods. There was no path. He must have been there many times before. After about 15 minutes, he slowed down and pointed ahead, smiling. I walked in front of him and saw a small structure, an old, abandoned RV or camper. Moss grew all over it and there were holes of rust. I turned back to William. His face was cold and empty. "William, what is this?" I asked. He didn't answer. I started looking around frantically. I heard the rusty metal door swing open behind me. Someone else came running out. I sprinted away. I heard William and the other person following. I ran until I lost them. I had no idea where I was. I just kept walking until sunrise. When I got back to the lake, all my camping gear was gone. I reported it to the police, but they never found anything. Story 7. The Snowy Airbnb. I was on a road trip from Portland to Chicago. My first Airbnb was in a small town in Wyoming. As I crossed the border, it started snowing heavily. By the time I arrived, the roads were covered and it was dark. I drove to my Airbnb, a small house in the middle of a field with pine trees. I parked and went inside. It was small, with a living room and bedroom. I sat on the couch and a thump came from the bedroom. I checked the room and the bathroom. Everything looked normal. The only other door was a bedroom closet. It was locked. I assumed it was a maintenance closet. After 15 minutes, I looked out the window. It was eerily dark. I shut the blinds and turned back to the couch. I saw a shadow move in the bedroom, like a door opening or closing. I listened as I approached the doorway. Everything was in place. My eyes fell on the closet. It was still closed, but I felt uneasy. I opened it. It wasn't locked anymore. It was empty. Then I heard someone behind me. A large man was standing in the bathroom doorway. He looked beaten and tired, with scratches and cuts. He stepped into the bedroom, grabbed a dirty duffel bag from under the bed, and walked out the front door. I saw him walking through the snow. I tried to involve the police, but they mostly talked to the Airbnb host. I never got any more information. Story 8. The Late Night Delivery. A few months ago, I was driving for DoorDash. One night, around 1 a.m., I picked up a small order to be delivered to a business building across town. When I arrived, the parking lot was empty. I parked near the front and got out. The building was small, only 2 stories. All the lights were off except one behind the front door. I checked the app. There were instructions to enter the main hallway and leave the bag outside room 232. I looked through the door and saw a hallway with doors on either side. I pushed the door, it was unlocked. I stepped inside. It was eerily silent. I passed doors numbered in the 100s. Room 232 was supposed to be on the 2nd floor. I saw the staircase held open by a doorstop, but the lights were off. The stairwell was pitch black. I felt a chill. I stepped back into the hallway. The door across from me opened. The lights in that room were off, but a man emerged. He was wearing street clothes and didn't look like an office worker. He pointed past me at the stairwell. 232 is up there. I nodded but didn't move. He just looked me in the eyes, suppressing anger. I dropped the bag and quickly walked to the exit. He didn't follow, but I heard his footsteps go up the stairs. The next day, the police called me. The office reported a break-in. CCTV footage showed my car and license plate. They also had footage of the break-in and questioned me. I didn't have much to give, but there were 3 people involved. 2 were hiding at the top of the stairs waiting for me. Several other delivery orders were made to the same office that night. All the other drivers left the orders outside. Story 9, the cabin in the woods. My wife and I take yearly vacations. This year we booked a cabin in Washington State. It was described as quiet and peaceful. We flew in, got groceries, and took a taxi to the cabin. The drive was over an hour, through beautiful mountain ranges and forests. At 7 p.m. we arrived. The cabin was completely alone in the middle of the forest. We brought our stuff inside. The cabin was small with a main floor and a loft bedroom. We unpacked, made a quick dinner, and opened a bottle of wine. Around 11 p.m., we heard someone walking in the grass near the cabin. I looked out the window. It was pitch black. I told my wife I didn't see anyone. I opened the front door and turned on the outdoor lights. I still didn't see anyone. I asked my wife if she still heard the footsteps. She said the sound just stopped suddenly from behind the cabin. I told her to go to the loft and stay quiet. I checked all the windows again. Then a thump shook the cabin. My wife looked up at the ceiling. Someone was on the roof. I called the police. Over the next hour, we occasionally heard footsteps on the roof. After about 45 minutes, we heard boots hit the ground, followed by someone walking away. I looked out the window and saw their outline disappear into the forest. The police took our report and gave us a ride into town. Story 10, the unseen housemaid. I've lived in my house for 8 years. It's a 4-bedroom house, but I only used 2 bedrooms after my roommates moved out. One night, after getting off work, I was gaming in my room. I thought I heard a knock at the door. I listened but didn't hear anything else. 2 hours later, I heard it again, a knock or a door closing. I checked downstairs. Nobody was outside. I locked the door and went back upstairs, leaving my door open this time. After about 20 minutes of gaming, a figure rushed past my open doorway. I took off my headphones and stared at the doorway. After several minutes, I checked the hallway and the rest of the house. Nobody was there, but the front door was unlocked again. The police investigated. The person had been hiding, likely living, in the empty room I hadn't been in for weeks or months. Story 11, the farmhouse Uber ride. When I was 19, I worked as an Uber driver. One night, around 11 p.m., I picked up a woman from a bar and drove her 35 minutes outside the city. After that, I got another request 10 minutes away, even further out. The road was through farmland. When I got to the last turn, it was a thin dirt road leading to a farmhouse on a hill. The lights were off and nobody was outside. I honked lightly. Then someone tapped on the passenger door. A man leaned his head through the open window and looked at me. He didn't say anything at first. I asked if he ordered the Uber. He looked in the back seat, nodded, and looked back at me. "Can you help me carry something out to the car?" he asked. I reluctantly agreed. He walked toward the house. I followed. He opened the door and rushed inside without looking back. The doorway showed an empty hallway. I couldn't hear him. "Sir?" I called out. There was no response. It was eerily quiet and dark. I turned and ran back to my car, canceling the Uber. I regret not notifying the police. I later found out the farmhouse was last sold in the 1960s. Story 12, the intruder in the night. A little over a year ago, I was alone in my townhouse. I had plans with my friend Sarah the next day. I went to bed early, around 9:15 p.m. In the middle of the night, I woke up. It was 2 a.m. My heart was pounding and I felt alert. Then I heard a click downstairs. A door slowly creaked open and I heard footsteps. Thinking it was Sarah or another friend with a key, I got up and opened my bedroom door. "Sarah?" I called. No one responded. I waited in the hallway. Then a bright light flickered on downstairs, followed by soft chattering from the living room. I went downstairs. A random man was sitting on my couch watching TV. He looked about 50 with patchy long black hair and dirty clothes. He glanced at me, smiled crookedly, and waved me over. I turned and sprinted out the front door. I banged on my neighbor's door until they let me in and called the police. By the time they arrived, the man was gone. The police didn't take it seriously, suggesting it was just a homeless man. But he had picked the lock, sat on my couch, and turned on the TV. He smiled at me and waved me over. I think he was a stalker. I find it hard to sleep alone now. I wake up in complete darkness, with only the sound of dripping and the tight straps binding me to a chair. I try to break free, but the chair is bolted to the floor. There's a strange odor in the air. My head throbs above my eye. I panic, screaming for help and calling out a name. I remember hiking by a lake. Then nothing. I scream until my throat is sore, then I just sob. A whisper creeps in from the darkness. "Feel better now?" I know we all need a good scream sometimes. I freeze, shaking. It's healthy to get those emotions out. If you keep it all inside, it'll just skin you alive. I hear wet, soft footsteps pacing. "You know, I knew from the very first time I saw you that we were meant for each other." The dripping intensifies. The voice moves closer. "I saw you there by the lake, under the shade of that big tree with him. I knew I couldn't measure up. I didn't know him, but I could see it, that he had something to offer you that I just didn't, because I'm not a person." Moist fingertips brush my shoulder. "It's not like he's gone, really. He and I have become very, very close." I manage to speak. "He's alive?" The man exhales softly. "Of course he is. He's more alive now than he ever was before or ever could have been. We both are." "What do you dash?" A click and fluorescent lights flicker on. The thing before me outstretches its arms, the skin hanging loose, staples glinting. I scream but hear nothing. In the corner, a long mass of red hangs from a hook. I recognize the smell: organs, viscera, blood. He closes the distance, wearing a familiar face like a mask, flesh stitched to his own. His torso hangs loose. He puts his hands on my arms. "It's all going to be all right," he says, his black marble eyes shimmering through the reddened holes of the suit. "Now I can be everything that you need me to be." Ready for a really scary story? I hated the summer house. We stayed there at least a week every year. The cabin, our family's summer home, sat on the edge of a large lake and was a modest 2-bedroom cabin with a loft. The floor had wide gaps between the boards, letting you see the underside. My dad always promised to replace them but never did. As the first week of our first visit went on, I started noticing strange noises from beneath the floorboards. It sounded like something moving, a scuffling like small animals or bugs. I sometimes saw glimpses of them, but they were too quick. Dad said it was probably just rodents. He put down traps, but they never caught anything. I never slept well after that first night. The scuffling would keep me awake. They sounded too big to be mice. We always had fun during the day, but I spent my nights praying I could fall asleep before the scratching started. When I was 10, we stayed there for 2 weeks after a storm knocked out the power. Every night, I lay there listening to the scrabbling. After 8 nights, I'd had enough. Around 11 o'clock, I stomped around as loud as I dared, hoping to scare them. The noise stopped. I crawled back into bed and finally fell asleep. But an hour later, the scrabbling started again, louder than ever. Something was trying to come through the floor. I saw something dark pushing between the cracks. I thought I saw fingers digging up. I grabbed my baseball bat and swung at the hand. It pulled back. Then I saw something worse, a single, bloodshot human eye staring back at me. I screamed. My parents came. I tried to explain, but they thought it was a nightmare. They let me sleep in the loft. I refused to be alone in the room. We didn't go back the next year, but we went when I was 12. I still had nightmares. I packed my bat and a flashlight. I tried to wear myself out that first day. I fell asleep quickly, but the scratching woke me in the wee hours. It was louder than ever, like animal claws. Something was moving beneath the boards, pushing its fingers through. I smashed the fingers with my bat. The eye returned. I couldn't sleep. The next night, the scrabbling was worse than ever. The boards began to buckle. I swung my bat, but it was like an army was under the floor. They started to press up into the room. I saw what was beneath, naked, skeletal people trying to come out. I counted 4, then 5, then maybe a half dozen. My dad came in. He grabbed me, pulled me out, closed the door, and put a chair under it. He woke up my sisters and took us to the loft. He had a pistol. We waited for the police. The police found signs of something moving under the house, even a jimmied screen, but not much else. The sheriff told my dad that the last owners, a man, woman, and 3 children, had gone missing suddenly. They found pushed-up boards in my room. My parents sold the lake house. We got a timeshare elsewhere. I still have nightmares. If you see a cabin for sale on the lake, be cautious. I hated the summer house. It was a modest 2-bedroom cabin with a loft, sitting on the edge of a large lake. The floorboards had wide gaps, revealing the dark space beneath. Dad always promised to fix them but never did. During our first visit, I was excited, exploring every inch of the cabin. But as the week progressed, I began hearing strange noises from under the floor, a scuffling like small animals or bugs. I sometimes glimpsed movement between the boards but never saw anything clearly. Dad dismissed it as rodents and set traps, which remained empty. I never slept well after that. The scuffling kept me awake, sounding too big for mice. I worried they'd come through the floor. We had fun during the day, but I dreaded the nights. When I was 10, we stayed for 2 weeks during a power outage. Every night, the scrabbling kept me awake. After 8 sleepless nights, around 11 o'clock, I stomped on the floor, hoping to scare them. The noise stopped briefly but returned louder than ever an hour later. Something was trying to push through the floor. I peeked over the bed and saw something dark pressing between the cracks, dirty fingers digging up. Frozen with fear, I grabbed my baseball bat and swung at the hand. It pulled back after a few hits. Then I saw it, a single bloodshot human eye staring back at me. I screamed. My parents came. They thought it was a nightmare and let me sleep in the loft. I refused to be alone in the room even during the day. When I was 12, we returned. I still had nightmares and packed my bat and a flashlight. The first night, the scratching woke me. It was louder, like animal claws on a chalkboard. I saw fingers pushing through the boards, some bent in odd ways. I smashed them with my bat. The eye returned. The next night, the scrabbling was even worse, like a beast with 1,000 fingers. The boards buckled. I swung my bat, but there were too many. They started pressing up into the room. I saw what was beneath, naked, skeletal people all trying to climb out. I counted several, their numbers growing. My dad came in. He saw them too. He grabbed me, pulled me out, barricaded the door, woke my sisters, and took us to the loft. He had a pistol. We waited for the police. The police found signs of movement under the house and a jimmied screen. The sheriff told my dad the previous owners, a family of 5, had gone missing. They found pushed-up boards in my room just like now. My parents sold the lake house. I still have nightmares. If you see a cabin for sale on the lake, be cautious. Be ready for our next story. Get ready for our next story. It felt fitting, after all, that it'd be my own blood that frees Ethan. The next few days were spent preparing. I checked in on Ethan regularly to see how he was doing without my blood supply. Not only was he fine, he looked healthier and more normal than he'd ever been. He insisted, however, that going this long without blood would kill him, so I endeavored to hurry up. I made a homemade 4 out of sewing needles, a turkey baster, and tubing from a long-dormant fish tank. I sat down on a chair in the basement kitchen, the 4 next to me over a plastic bucket. I spent an hour sterilizing everything as best I could with what I had. I stabbed the needle into my cephalic vein and let gravity do the rest. Slowly but surely, the bucket began to fill up. I sat there until I felt dizzy. I groggily pulled the makeshift hypodermic needle out of my arm and collapsed back into the chair. After a few minutes, I managed to collect myself. I steadily got to my feet and looked at the bucket. There was barely any blood in it. I found a 1L measuring jug that I'd never used before and poured it in. It just about filled it to the brim. More than I thought, but nowhere near enough. I brought the jug out to Ethan, careful not to spill any. His blank eyes lit up when he saw me. I held the jug over him, his mouth hanging expectantly open. I poured my blood and he began to giggle just like he would when we were kids. His gullet filled with my black clots, and it began to overspill, dribbling down his chin and onto his chest. Once the jug was empty, I let it fall to the floor. Ethan began thanking me, calling me his best friend, saying we'd never part. I felt a warmth I hadn't experienced since before my father died. Wood splintered as he pulled his other arm free. I knew what to do. I leaned in and we hugged each other. We will never part again, Daniel. I know, Ethan. I'll never let you go again. He smelled like death, but I didn't care. He pulled me tighter and whispered in my ear. But I'm still not free. I recoiled from his embrace. I should have known that he wouldn't be satiated. I had to avert my gaze from Ethan. I could tell he was scowling at me. I walked back to the house, leaving Ethan to calm down. I slumped onto my couch, trying to think of what I should do next. I noticed my phone on the coffee table. The past few days had been a monofocused blur. I couldn't remember the last time I picked up my phone. I grabbed it and immediately saw that Laura had been trying to contact me. I had dozens of unread texts and missed calls from her. I'd been doing my best to avoid her at work. She tried to come around yesterday and I just hid in my room and pretended to be out. I tapped on the notifications and read through the catalog of messages. All had the same theme, something to do with my well-being. I lay back and decided to give her a call. The phone rang for a while before she picked up. She didn't sound as concerned as I thought she'd be, but she was happy to know I was all right. She repeated what she'd been saying over text, that I felt different, distant. I told her that I was fine really, and that she should come over tonight. She agreed and said that she would be around at about 8 p.m. We wished each other goodbye until then and I hung up. I had a plan. I knew that there was no other choice. If I wanted to free Ethan, finally free him, then this is what I must do. I put on a jacket and slid a kitchen knife into the inside pocket. I sat and waited for Laura. She arrived half an hour late, an impressive feat considering she only lived 10 minutes away. I could tell that she knew something was up. I didn't know what to do, so I blurted out that I had been diagnosed with depression. It seemed to click for her then what was wrong, and she took to comforting me as best she could. Laura had always been a nature enthusiast. She made me try out veganism once or twice, but it never stuck. Hearing about my struggle, the first thing she suggested was that I should get out in nature more. She asked me if there was any place where I felt truly happy. I stifled a smile and told her that I knew a place. My heart beat like a tribal drum as I led Laura from my house, through my garden, and out into the forest. I stopped for a second, letting her walk just in front of me as we came up to the stump. A few steps later she saw it. Ethan had metamorphosed since this morning. His skin had been replaced with a black mold. The only features of his face were his white eyes and teeth, floating in an inky nothingness. He didn't look like Ethan at all anymore. His red t-shirt was gone, digested into his body. Wispy tendrils protruded from all over his form and connected him to the ruined oak that rose on either side of him. He still sat comfortably within the stump but looked like he was beginning to spill out. Laura let out a scream that sent the crows flying from their perch. Before she could run, before she could react, before she could do anything else, I grabbed her. I pushed her forward until she was inches from Ethan's grinning maw. I took the knife from my pocket and slit her throat. Her screams turned to a gurgle and then ended. Blood poured from the wound onto Ethan, who still spoke with the voice of a child. "This is it," he decreed, "just a little more." He was still saying that by the time her neck ran dry. I maneuvered her body, trying desperately not to throw up. I cut both of her wrists and held her in place as the blood flowed. Suddenly, Ethan began to bubble. Pustules sprang up and popped all over his body. He expanded, almost entirely enveloping the stump. I stumbled back and let Laura's body fall. Ethan's eyes rolled back into his head and disappeared, along with his teeth. His body had lost all shape now. It was just a black, writhing mass. Two hands pierced the top of the mass and split it open like a satchel. The man began to rise from the black pile, floating up through the air. It was an elderly man of enigmatic origin, his presence ancient and unknowable. His legs were covered in intricate symbols of red and white, and he wore a tattered animal hide skirt. Around his neck was a carcanet of beads and feathers. He began speaking in a language I couldn't begin to understand. I only recognized one word: Okius. He didn't even look at me. He kept rising into the air, past the tree line and further still. I craned my neck and shielded my eyes from the evening sun. The man continued up into the sky until he came to a stop 100 feet or so from the ground. His incantations hastened, and he began to vibrate. Suddenly, he exploded into a cloud of ash, which caught on the wind and fluttered away. I clambered over to the stump, but the black mess had already begun to evaporate. There was no trace of Ethan. There was no sign that he'd been there at all. There was nothing. I spent the next few years on the run for murder. My old life died with Laura. In the past 8 years, I've written this account out dozens of times. It is my admission of guilt. Now I am finally at peace with it. Make of it what you will and leave me unburdened. I don't know what I let into the world, but there is nothing left I can do.